The steam hissed through rusted pipes like angry whispers, while the acrid smell of hot metal and machine oil hung thick in the Indiana air. Harold Wickham's weathered hands gripped his mop handle as the factory floor trembled beneath the weight of Assembly Line 7, the pride of Midwest manufacturing, churning out automotive parts that kept Detroit's dreams alive. This is the story of a man who became invisible in plain sight, until the day his silence saved everything. November 15th, 1973. The morning shift supervisors gathered in their glass-walled office above the production floor, their voices rising with each passing minute. Through the grimy windows, Harold could see them gesturing wildly at charts and blueprints, their faces flushed with panic. Line 7 had been running at 60% efficiency for 3 weeks, a hemorrhaging wound that bled $10 million in potential contracts. "That old coot doesn't belong here anyway," sneered production manager Carl Brennan, his voice carrying down to the factory floor where Harold methodically cleaned the same spot for the 3rd time. 42 years of pushing a broom around. What's he good for, except collecting a pension check? The other executives laughed, their dismissive chuckles echoing off the concrete walls. Harold's shoulders tensed, but he kept cleaning. At 71, he'd learned that invisibility was sometimes a mercy. But Harold Wickham harbored a secret that would have silenced every laugh in that room. 8-year-old Danny Morrison, the security guard's grandson, skipped between the machinery during his after-school visit. The boy always found Harold during these trips, drawn by the old man's gentle presence and mysterious knowledge of how everything worked. Today, Danny clutched a broken toy robot, its mechanical arm hanging by a single wire. "Mr. Harold, can you fix him?" Danny's eyes held that pure trust that only children possess. Harold knelt beside the boy, his arthritic fingers surprisingly delicate as they worked. Within moments, the toy whirred back to life, its arm moving in perfect synchronization. Danny's face lit up with wonder. "How do you always know how to fix things?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Harold's eyes drifted toward Assembly Line 7, where the massive production machine, his machine continued its struggling rhythm. For 42 years, he'd watched other men take credit for his creation. For 42 years, he'd remained silent about the blueprints he'd drawn in 1931, fresh out of technical college, young and full of dreams that had been crushed under the weight of class and circumstance. The executives above were still laughing when the factory whistle screamed its lunch break call, but their laughter was about to die in their throats. What would you do if you held the solution to everyone's problems, but nobody would listen because they couldn't see past your uniform? Because Harold Wickham was about to prove that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes has nothing to lose. Before we continue this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Are you having your morning coffee in California? Or maybe it's late night where you are. And if this story is already drawing you in, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories like this one. The lunch whistle's echo hadn't yet faded when Assembly Line 7 shuddered to a complete stop, its silence more deafening than any scream. $10 million had just walked out the door, and nobody in that glass office knew how to bring it back. Harold set down his mop and walked toward the massive machine that dominated the factory floor. His feet moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew every bolt, every gear, every whispered secret of the mechanical giant before him. The smell of overheated bearings mixed with the metallic taste of desperation that now filled the air. Danny appeared at his side, clutching his newly repaired robot. "Mr. Harold, why did the big machine stop singing?" The boy's innocent question cut through the growing chaos above. Through the glass walls, Harold could see Carl Brennan pacing like a caged animal, his expensive suit already darkened with sweat stains. 3 other executives hunched over technical manuals they clearly didn't understand, their fingers tracing meaningless diagrams. "Machines have feelings too, Danny boy," Harold said softly, his weathered hand resting on a support beam. Sometimes they stop singing when they're not being listened to properly. The truth was far more complex. Harold's trained ear had been picking up the telltale signs for weeks. A quarter note delay in the primary drive sequence, a harmonic vibration that spoke of misaligned timing gears. He'd written reports about it in his careful longhand, submitting them to the suggestion box that nobody ever checked. He tried approaching Brennan directly, only to be dismissed with a wave and a reminder to stick to your mop, old-timer. Now the chicken had come home to roost. Get me Detroit on the line, Brennan's voice carried down from the office. Tell them we need their best engineer on the next flight. I don't care what it costs. Harold almost smiled. Detroit's best engineer had been standing right here for 42 years, invisible in his janitor's coveralls. The factory floor emptied as word spread through the building. Workers gathered in nervous clusters, whispering about layoffs and plant closures. Midwest manufacturing had survived the Depression, 2 wars, and countless recessions, but this felt different. This felt terminal. Danny tugged at Harold's sleeve. Are you going to fix the singing machine? The question hung in the thick air like a prayer. Harold knelt down, meeting the boy's trusting gaze. In those young eyes, he saw something he'd almost forgotten. The belief that right could triumph over wrong, that truth would always rise to the surface. Justice sleeps, but never dies. Would you like to see something special, Danny? Harold asked, pulling a folded piece of yellowed paper from his back pocket. It was one of the original blueprints, hand-drawn in fading ink, dated March 22nd, 1931. The signature at the bottom read, H. Wickham, Technical Design. Danny's eyes widened as he studied the intricate drawings. You drew this? Long time ago, son, when I was younger than your daddy. The story poured out in whispers. How Harold had come to Midwest manufacturing fresh out of technical college, full of ideas and innovations. How he designed Assembly Line 7 as his masterpiece, a machine so advanced it could produce parts with tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. How his supervisor had taken the blueprints, filed them under his own name, and received the promotion that should have been Harold's. Why didn't you tell anyone? Danny asked with the directness of childhood. Harold's laugh was soft and bitter. In 1931, son, a working man's word wasn't worth much against a supervisor with connections. I had a choice. Stay quiet and keep my job, or speak up and lose everything. Above them, the executives were making increasingly desperate phone calls. The engineer from Detroit wouldn't arrive until tomorrow morning. Production schedules were crumbling. Contracts were being canceled. But Harold Wickham had never stopped loving his creation. Every morning for 4 decades, he'd arrived early to listen to Line 7's mechanical heartbeat. He knew every vibration, every sound, every subtle shift in rhythm that spoke of wear or misalignment. While others saw only a machine, Harold saw his life's work, neglected, misunderstood, but still magnificent. Mr. Harold, Danny whispered, what if they fire everyone because the machine won't sing? The boy's fear was palpable, and Harold felt something crack inside his chest. All these years of silent endurance, all these decades of swallowed pride, what had it accomplished? The young workers on the floor had families to feed, mortgages to pay, dreams of their own. What would you do if your silence had become complicity in others' suffering? Because as 5 o'clock approached and Assembly Line 7 remained as quiet as a tomb, Harold Wickham was about to make a decision that would either vindicate 42 years of patient waiting or destroy the careful invisibility that had protected him for so long. At 5:47 that evening, Carl Brennan descended from his glass tower, his Italian leather shoes clicking against concrete like a countdown timer. The smell of his expensive cologne couldn't mask the sour stench of panic sweat that followed him down. The lives of 312 workers now hung in the balance, and the man who could save them all was still invisible. Harold stood beside Assembly Line 7, one weathered hand resting on the machine's silent housing. He could feel its stillness, like a physical ache. 42 years of watching his creation suffer under the hands of men who understood its mechanics, but not its soul. Danny sat cross-legged nearby, still clutching his repaired robot, unaware that he was about to witness history in the making. "Wickham!" Brennan's voice cut through the factory's twilight quiet. "What are you still doing here?" "Shift ended 20 minutes ago." Harold turned slowly, studying the younger man's face with new intensity. The recognition had been building all afternoon, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The sharp jawline, the steel-gray eyes, even the way Brennan carried himself with that particular brand of inherited arrogance. It all clicked into place with devastating clarity. "You're Thomas Brennan's boy," Harold said quietly. The words hit Brennan like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed red with something between embarrassment and fury. Thomas Brennan, his father, had been production supervisor in 1931, the man who'd taken credit for designing Assembly Line 7, the man who'd built his entire career on Harold Wickham's stolen blueprints. "That's ancient history, old man," Brennan snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. "My father's been dead 15 years. Your father was a thief." The accusation hung in the factory air like smoke. Danny looked up from his robot, sensing the sudden tension, but not understanding its source. Around them, the massive machinery stood silent witnesses to a confrontation 4 decades in the making. Brennan stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You better watch your mouth, Janitor. My father built this place. He made Line 7 what it is." Harold reached into his coveralls and pulled out the yellowed blueprint, unfolding it with careful reverence. The date was clearly visible. March 22nd, 1931. The signature read H. Wickham, in fading but unmistakable ink. "Your father couldn't design a paper airplane, son, but he was real good at putting his name on other people's work." The blood drained from Brennan's face as he stared at the blueprint. His hands trembled as he reached for it, but Harold pulled it back. "Where did you get this?" Brennan whispered. "I drew it 42 years ago, when I was young enough to believe that merit mattered more than connections." Harold's voice carried no anger, only the weight of accumulated truth. "Your father took my designs, filed them under his name, and got the promotion that should have been mine. I kept quiet because I had a family to feed and nowhere else to go." The factory seemed to hold its breath. Even the ambient hum of distant machinery faded to nothing. Brennan's face cycled through emotions: shock, denial, guilt, and finally, desperate calculation. Even if that were true, it doesn't matter now. The machine's broken, and you're just a janitor. You don't know anything about fixing industrial equipment. Harold almost smiled. "Son, I designed every gear, every belt, every timing sequence in that machine. I know why it's making that quarter-note delay in the drive sequence. I know why the harmonic vibration started 3 weeks ago. And I know exactly how to fix it." "You're lying. The primary synchronization gear has shifted 2 degrees off-center," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. "The belt tension on the secondary drive is running 3 pounds over specification, and the timing sequence controller needs to be recalibrated to account for wear patterns that I calculated would develop after approximately 40 years of operation." Brennan's mouth fell open. The technical details were too precise, too specific for a janitor to know. "How do you?" "Because I built contingencies into the original design. I knew this machine would need adjustments as it aged. I wrote maintenance protocols that your father buried along with my blueprints." Harold folded the blueprint and tucked it back into his pocket. "I've been watching my life's work suffer for 4 decades, waiting for the day when someone would finally listen." Danny stood up, his young voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Harold, are you going to fix the singing machine now?" The question crystallized everything. Harold looked at the boy innocent, trusting, representing all the families whose livelihoods depended on this moment. Then he looked at Brennan, the son paying for his father's sins. trapped in a web of inherited guilt and corporate desperation. Truth has its own timeline. I can have Line 7 running at full efficiency in 30 minutes, Harold said quietly. But first, we need to discuss terms. Brennan's face went through another transformation, from shock to calculation to something that might have been respect. What kind of terms? Harold smiled for the first time in years, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who'd waited 42 years for justice and finally saw it approaching. What would you do if you held the power to save everyone, but only by destroying the lies that had shaped your entire life? Because Harold Wickham was about to prove that some debts can only be paid in full, and the price of truth was always higher than anyone expected to pay. Harold's terms cut through the factory silence like a blade through silk, each word carrying the weight of 4 decades of patient suffering. The future of Midwest manufacturing now hung on the decision of a man who had everything to lose and nothing left to fear. First, Harold said, his voice steady as bedrock, you call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. All executives, all department heads. I want them to hear the truth about who really designed Assembly Line 7. Brennan's face went ashen. The implications crashed over him like a wave. His father's reputation, his own career built on inherited lies. The complete restructuring of company history that would be required. Harold, you don't understand. That would destroy. Your father destroyed my life 42 years ago, Harold interrupted, his voice carrying no malice, only truth. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for recognition. Danny watched from his perch on a nearby crate, his robot forgotten in his lap. The boy's presence served as a reminder that this moment wasn't just about past injustices. It was about the future that 300 families were counting on. The smell of cooling metal filled the air as evening shadows stretched across the factory floor. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few dedicated supervisors who'd stayed behind to witness what everyone suspected might be the plant's final hours. Second, Harold continued, I want my original blueprints returned to the company files with proper attribution. And third, I want a consulting position with full access to Line 7's maintenance records. This machine needs someone who understands its soul, not just its specifications. Brennan paced between the silent machinery, his expensive shoes echoing off concrete that had absorbed 40 years of Harold's quiet footsteps. The young executive's world was crumbling, but Harold felt no satisfaction in it, only the weary determination of a man who'd waited long enough for justice. And if I refuse? Brennan asked, though they both knew he had no choice. Then Line 7 stays broken. Detroit's engineer won't be able to fix it because the problem isn't in any manual they've ever written. The solutions are in my head, based on design principles I developed before your father was old enough to shave. Harold's weathered hands traced the machine's housing with familiar affection. You'll lose the Chrysler contract, then Ford, then GM. This plant will be closed by Christmas. The mathematics of desperation were simple and brutal. Brennan stopped pacing and stared at Harold with something approaching respect. You've had this power all along. Why wait until now? Because I'm 71 years old, son. I don't have time left to be invisible. Harold glanced at Danny, whose young eyes reflected absolute trust in the old janitor's abilities. And because that boy over there represents every family in this town who depends on this place for their livelihood, I won't let them suffer for your father's sins. The factory's clock tower chimed 6:30. Time was running out on multiple levels, not just for the emergency repairs, but for Harold's own failing health. The arthritis in his hands was getting worse, the pain in his chest more frequent. This might be his last chance to set the record straight. There's something else, Harold said quietly. The modifications I'm going to make tonight, they'll increase Line 7's efficiency by 30%. The machine will produce parts faster and more accurately than ever before. But those improvements die with me, unless someone else learns the principles behind them. Brennan's eyes widened. A 30% efficiency increase would transform Midwest manufacturing from a struggling regional player into a major industrial force. The potential profits were staggering. You're talking about training a replacement, Brennan realized. I'm talking about passing on 42 years of accumulated knowledge to someone who'll respect it. Harold's gaze drifted to the executive offices above, where other supervisors were still making frantic phone calls. The question is whether this company is ready to learn from a man they've been calling just a janitor for 4 decades. Danny suddenly spoke up, his child's voice cutting through the adult tension. "Mr. Harold, are you going to teach me how to fix the singing machine?" The innocence of the question made both men smile, despite the circumstances. Harold knelt down to the boy's level, his expression gentle. "Someday, Danny boy. But first, we need to convince the grown-ups that old dogs can still learn new tricks." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the factory. 3 more executives were descending from the offices above, drawn by curiosity and desperation. Word was spreading that Harold Wickham, the invisible janitor, might hold the key to their salvation. "All right," Brennan said finally, his voice hoarse with resignation and something that might have been hope. "You've got a deal. Fix the machine, and we'll discuss everything else tomorrow." Harold nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Son, once I start making these adjustments, there's no going back. Everyone in this building will know that the old janitor understood this machinery better than any engineer who ever walked through those doors." The weight of that truth settled over them both. Brennan extended his hand. "Then I guess it's time for some people to eat crow." As Harold shook the younger man's hand, he felt something shift in the factory's atmosphere. The machine wasn't the only thing that needed repair. Decades of institutional blindness, inherited guilt, and willful ignorance were about to be confronted head-on. Truth waits for no one. But as Harold moved toward Assembly Line 7's control panel, tools already materializing in his experienced hands, he had no way of knowing that someone in the executive offices above was making a desperate phone call. A call that would turn his moment of triumph into something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. What happens when the truth threatens more than just one man's reputation? Because Harold Wickham was about to discover that some secrets are buried so deep that exposing them can cost more than just a career. They can cost everything. Harold's fingers moved across Assembly Line 7's control panel like a pianist returning to a beloved instrument after decades of silence, each switch and dial responding to his touch, with the recognition that only comes from true understanding. The machine that had defined his life was about to reveal its secrets, but powerful men were already moving to ensure those secrets died with him. 7:15 in the evening. The factory floor hummed with nervous energy as word spread through the remaining supervisors and security staff. Harold Wickham, the invisible janitor, was attempting to repair the most sophisticated piece of machinery in the building. Some watched with curiosity, others with skepticism, but all with the desperate hope of drowning men clinging to driftwood. Danny sat cross-legged on a nearby crate, his repaired robot forgotten as he watched Harold work. The old man's movements were precise, economical, beautiful in their efficiency. 42 years of observation had taught him every nuance of the machine's personality, every quirk and preference that no manual could capture. "First thing," Harold murmured, more to himself than to a small audience, "we listen to what she's trying to tell us." He placed his weathered hand on the main housing and closed his eyes. Through decades of experience, he could feel the subtle vibrations that spoke of misaligned components, the temperature variations that revealed friction points, the almost imperceptible shifts that indicated worn bearings. The smell of machine oil and hot metal intensified as Harold opened an access panel that most engineers would have needed blueprints to locate. His hands moved with surgical precision. adjusting timing gears that had drifted out of alignment over 4 decades of operation. "See there, Danny?" Harold pointed to a complex arrangement of gears and drive belts. "That's the heart of the whole system. Your father was right when he said machines have souls. This is where it lives." Carl Brennan watched from a respectful distance, his face cycling between amazement and growing dread. Every adjustment Harold made was exactly what the diagnostic manuals would have recommended if anyone had known where to look. The old man's knowledge was encyclopedic, intuitive, impossible to fake. But upstairs in the executive offices, Regional Manager Vincent Morrison was ending a phone call that would change everything. His face was pale as he hung up the receiver, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his coat. "Where are you going?" asked Chief Financial Officer Robert Hayes, who'd witnessed the entire conversation. "To make sure this problem gets buried permanently," Morrison replied, his voice hollow, "before it destroys more than just this plant." The truth Harold was about to reveal reached far beyond stolen blueprints and family shame. Assembly Line 7's revolutionary design had been reverse-engineered and sold to 3 other manufacturing companies over the years, generating millions in licensing fees. If Harold's authorship became public knowledge, the legal implications would be catastrophic. More than careers were at stake. Industrial espionage charges, patent fraud, conspiracy. The dominoes would fall across multiple states, multiple companies, multiple lives, built on a foundation of lies. Morrison's footsteps echoed down the metal stairs as he descended toward the factory floor. But Harold was too absorbed in his work to notice the approaching danger. "Hand me that 7/16 wrench, would you, Danny?" The boy eagerly complied, becoming Harold's unofficial assistant. Together, they worked in companionable silence, the old man's expertise paired with youthful enthusiasm. It was the kind of bonding moment that Harold had dreamed of having with a grandson, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. The primary synchronization gear clicked into perfect alignment with a sound like a lock opening. Harold smiled, the first genuine expression of joy anyone had seen on his face in years. "There she is," he whispered. 42 years later, and she still remembers how to sing. The machine's rhythm began to change, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. The quarter-note delay disappeared. The harmonic vibration smoothed into perfect mechanical music. Assembly Line 7 was waking up from its troubled sleep. "Mr. Harold," Danny said quietly, "there's a man coming who looks angry." Harold glanced up to see Morrison approaching with purposeful strides, his expensive overcoat billowing behind him like dark wings. The regional manager's face was set in lines of grim determination, and Harold's survival instincts, honed by 7 decades of navigating corporate politics, began screaming warnings. "Wickham," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the factory floor. "Step away from that machine. Now." Harold's hands stilled on the controls. Around them, the few remaining workers sensed the shift in atmosphere, the electricity of impending confrontation. Even Danny seemed to shrink back, his child's intuition detecting adult danger. "Mr. Morrison," Harold said carefully, straightening to his full height. "I'm just making some adjustments that—" "You're interfering with company property without authorization," Morrison interrupted. "Security will escort you from the building immediately." The words hit like physical blows. After 42 years of faithful service, after agreeing to save the plant and everyone in it, Harold was being thrown out like garbage. Carl Brennan stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Vincent, what the hell are you doing? He's fixing the line. He knows more about that machine than anyone alive." Morrison's laugh was cold and bitter. "He knows too much. About everything." The admission hung in the factory air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Harold's eyes widened as understanding crashed over him. This wasn't about fixing Assembly Line 7 anymore. This was about silencing the man who could expose decades of systematic fraud. 2 security guards appeared as if from nowhere, their faces apologetic but their intentions clear. Harold looked at Danny, saw the fear and confusion in the boy's eyes, and felt something break inside his chest. Justice delayed is justice denied. Take your hands off me, Harold said quietly as the guards moved closer. I'm not finished here. But as Morrison's smile grew wider and the security guards reached for his arms, Harold Wickham realized that some battles couldn't be won with truth alone. What would you do if the very act of helping others painted a target on your back that reached far beyond anything you'd ever imagined? Because Harold was about to discover that when you threaten to expose a conspiracy worth millions of dollars, the people with the most to lose will do whatever it takes to protect their secrets, even if it means destroying an innocent man who only wanted his life's work to be remembered. The security guard's hands never reached Harold Wickham because 8-year-old Danny Morrison stepped between them with the fearless determination that only comes from absolute trust in someone you love. In that moment, the entire conspiracy balanced on the courage of a child who refused to let the grown-ups hurt his friend. You can't take Mr. Harold away. Danny's voice rang across the factory floor with crystalline clarity. He's fixing the singing machine. He's helping everyone. The guards hesitated, their training never having covered what to do when a child became a human shield. Vincent Morrison's face darkened with fury, but even he couldn't order the physical removal of a security guard's grandson without creating a public relations nightmare. Harold knelt beside Danny, his weathered hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. It's okay, son. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions. But you're not finished, Danny protested, tears threatening. The machine still needs you. Around them, the factory floor had grown silent, except for the increasingly smooth rhythm of Assembly Line 7. Harold's adjustments were working. The machine was returning to life with each passing minute, its mechanical song growing stronger and more perfect. The smell of success mixed with the acrid stench of corporate fear as more workers emerged from the shadows, drawn by curiosity about the confrontation. These were Harold's colleagues, people who'd worked beside him for decades, who'd shared coffee breaks and complained about management, who'd never really seen him until this moment. Vincent, Carl Brennan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. This is insane. He's saving the plant. He's saving all of us. Morrison's laugh was hollow. Carl, you don't understand the bigger picture. If Wickham's story gets out, if people learn he designed Line 7, the lawsuits alone will destroy 3 companies. We've been licensing his technology for 40 years without knowing it. The legal exposure is catastrophic. The admission sent shockwaves through the growing crowd. Harold's design hadn't just been stolen. Once it had been sold over and over, generating millions in profits, while the true inventor mopped floors and remained invisible. So you'd rather let the plant close than give credit where it's due? Asked Marie Kowalski, a line supervisor who'd worked under Harold's quiet guidance for 15 years. Her voice carried the weight of moral authority that comes from absolute certainty about right and wrong. I'd rather protect the livelihoods of thousands of people across multiple states, Morrison shot back. Sometimes the truth is a luxury we can't afford. Harold stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with the weight of accumulated years. Around him, Assembly Line 7 continued its return to perfect operation. Every adjustment he'd made working in harmony to create something beautiful and efficient and revolutionary. Mr. Morrison, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the factory's unusual silence. I've been invisible for 42 years. I've watched other men take credit for my work, profit from my ideas, build careers on my innovations. I stayed quiet because I thought that was the honorable thing to do. He gestured toward the workers gathering around them, people whose faces reflected hope for the first time in weeks. But silence isn't honor when it enables injustice, and invisibility isn't humility when it allows good people to suffer. Harold reached into his coveralls and pulled out the yellowed blueprint, unfolding it with reverent care. The paper was fragile, but the ink was still clear, the signature still legible after 4 decades. This is my design, my innovation, my life's work. His voice grew stronger with each word, and I'll be damned if I'll let it die in darkness just to protect the men who stole it. Danny clapped his hands together, his child's understanding cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Mr. Harold is going to be famous now. The innocence of the observation broke something in the adults around him. These were working people, honest people, who understood the value of giving credit where credit was due. They'd all been cheated by management at some point, passed over for promotions, denied recognition for their contributions. Marie Kowalski stepped forward first. Harold, we believe you. We've all seen how you know things about these machines that no janitor should know. Others nodded in agreement. 42 years of quiet competence had earned Harold something more valuable than official recognition, the respect of his peers. Morrison's face went pale as he realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. This conversation ends now. Security, remove Wickham from the premises. Immediately. But the security guards looked at each other, then at Danny's tearful face, then at the crowd of workers who'd formed a protective circle around Harold. These weren't corporate executives, they were local men with families and consciences, and they understood the difference between following orders and enabling injustice. Sir, the senior guard said carefully, maybe we should let Mr. Wickham finish his work. The machine does seem to be running better. Morrison's composure finally cracked completely. Are you all insane? Do you have any idea what this will cost? What it will destroy? Harold's answer came quietly, but it carried the authority of absolute truth. It will cost lies their power, Mr. Morrison, and it will destroy the illusion that some people's comfort matters more than other people's dignity. The factory clock tower chimed 8:30 as Assembly Line 7 achieved perfect synchronization for the first time in months. The machine's song had returned rich, complex, beautiful in its mechanical precision. But as Harold basked in the sound of his life's work finally singing as it was meant to sing, none of them noticed Morrison reaching for his phone to make one final, desperate call. What would you do if exposing the truth meant destroying not just your enemies, but potentially everyone around you? Because Harold Wickham was about to learn that when you corner desperate people with everything to lose, they don't surrender. They escalate in ways that can transform a moment of triumph into a fight for survival itself. Morrison's phone call lasted exactly 97 seconds. But those 97 seconds would determine whether Harold Wickham lived to see his vindication or died protecting the truth he'd carried for 42 years. The conspiracy that had stolen one man's life was about to reveal just how far powerful people would go to protect their empire of lies. 8:45 in the evening. The factory floor buzzed with nervous energy as Assembly Line 7 hummed in perfect synchronization, its mechanical song more beautiful than it had been in months. Harold stood, surrounded by his fellow workers, people who'd finally seen him, really seen him, for the first time in decades. But Vincent Morrison's face had gone from pale to ashen, his expensive suit wrinkled with panic sweat. The phone call he'd just completed had changed everything. Harold, Morrison said, his voice unnaturally calm. I've just spoken with corporate headquarters in Detroit. They're very interested in your claims about Line 7's design. The words should have been reassuring, but Harold's survival instincts, sharpened by 71 years of navigating a world that had never been fair to men like him, recognized the danger beneath Morrison's suddenly smooth tone. What did they say? Carl Brennan asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Morrison's smile was cold as winter steel. They're sending a team of corporate investigators. They'll be here by morning to review all documentation related to Assembly Line 7's development. Until then, this entire matter is classified. Anyone discussing it outside this room will be terminated immediately. The threat hung in the factory air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Danny tugged at Harold's coveralls. Mr. Harold, what does classified mean? It means they want us to keep secrets, Danny boy, Harold said softly, but his weathered hands were trembling slightly. He'd seen this play before: corporate damage control, the systematic burial of inconvenient truths, the destruction of evidence that might prove embarrassing to powerful men. Marie Kowalski stepped forward, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd spent 30 years watching honest people get crushed by corporate machinery. Vincent, you can't just sweep this under the rug. Harold deserves recognition for his work. What Harold deserves, Morrison replied, is irrelevant compared to what 3,000 employees across 4 states need: job security. If this story gets out, if the lawsuits start flying, entire plants will close. Is one old man's pride worth destroying that many families? The manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Morrison was weaponizing their compassion, using their care for their coworkers as leverage to silence Harold's legitimate claims. But Harold Wickham had spent 4 decades watching powerful men use such tactics, and he was tired of being moved around like a chess piece in other people's games. Mr. Morrison, Harold said quietly, there's something you need to understand. I didn't spend 42 years in silence just to break it for personal recognition. He gestured toward assembly line 7, now running at 98% efficiency, higher than it had operated since its installation. Truth never dies completely. I broke my silence because my machine was suffering. Because good people were going to lose their jobs because nobody understood how to care for something I created with my own hands. Harold's voice grew stronger with each word. And because I'm 71 years old, and I don't have time left to be afraid of corporate lawyers and their threats. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. Harold, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. The patent licensing alone involves $47 million in existing contracts. The legal exposure could destroy lies, Harold interrupted, could destroy careers built on stolen work, could destroy the comfortable illusion that some people's success matters more than other people's dignity. The factory workers around them murmured agreement. These were people who'd been stepped on by management, passed over for promotions, denied credit for their contributions. Harold's fight was their fight, and they recognized it. Danny suddenly spoke up, his child's voice cutting through the adult tension. My daddy says lying is wrong, even when it's hard to tell the truth. The innocence of the observation shattered Morrison's carefully constructed argument. Out of the mouths of babes came the moral clarity that adults often lost in their complicated justifications. Morrison's phone rang. He answered it with visible dread, and his face went white as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Yes, sir. I understand. No, sir. The situation is not contained. He hung up and stared at Harold with something approaching desperation. Harold, that was Detroit. They've decided to offer you a settlement. Full recognition of your design work, a consulting position, and a substantial financial compensation package. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement about the irregularities in the original patent filing. The offer was everything Harold could have dreamed of, wrapped in legal language designed to ensure his silence about the conspiracy that had stolen his life's work. How much? Asked Carl Brennan. $2 million, Morrison replied, tax-free, plus full health benefits and a pension that reflects his actual contributions to the company. The sum was staggering. More money than Harold had earned in his entire career, enough to secure his final years, to leave something meaningful to the family he'd never had. But as he looked at Danny's trusting face, at the workers who'd finally seen him as more than invisible, at the machine that sang with his genius, Harold Wickham realized that some things couldn't be bought. What would you do if offered everything you'd ever wanted in exchange for allowing a lifetime of injustice to remain buried forever? Because Harold was about to make a choice that would either crown his vindication or seal his destruction. And the powerful men in Detroit had already decided that if he wouldn't take their money, they'd ensure he never lived to spend anyone else's. Harold Wickham looked at the $2 million offer for exactly 13 seconds, then tore the contract in half with the steady hands of a man who'd finally found something worth more than money. In that moment, the invisible janitor became the most dangerous person in corporate America, a man who couldn't be bought, silenced, or forgotten. "Keep your blood money, Mr. Morrison," Harold said quietly, the pieces of the contract fluttering to the factory floor like autumn leaves. "Some things aren't for sale." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: shock, desperation, and finally, a cold calculation that made Harold's blood run cold. "Harold, you're making a terrible mistake, the kind of mistake that ruins more than just careers." But before Morrison could elaborate on his threat, the factory's main doors burst open with the authority of federal law enforcement. 6 FBI agents swept across the floor, their presence transforming the industrial space into something that felt like a courtroom. "Vincent Morrison," the lead agent announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, patent theft, and racketeering." The handcuffs clicked around Morrison's wrists with the finality of justice long delayed. His expensive suit couldn't protect him now from the consequences of 42 years of systematic theft. "How?" Morrison whispered, his corporate composure finally shattered completely. Agent Patricia Wells held up a thick folder of documents. "Anonymous tip came in 3 hours ago. Complete documentation of patent fraud, spanning 4 decades, including original blueprints, signed by Harold Wickham, and detailed evidence of licensing fraud across multiple companies." Harold's eyes widened in surprise, but Carl Brennan was smiling. "The board meeting I called wasn't just for this plant, Harold. I contacted every executive involved in Line 7's licensing deals. Turns out, when you threaten people's careers with the truth, some of them decide to save themselves by exposing everyone else." The dominoes that had protected the conspiracy for decades were finally falling. Danny ran to Harold's side, his young face bright with excitement. "Mr. Harold, are you famous now?" "Not famous, son," Harold replied, kneeling to the boy's level. "Just finally visible." As Morrison was led away, he turned back with a final, desperate plea. "Harold, you don't understand what you've done. The lawsuits will destroy thousands of jobs. The legal battles will give credit where credit is due," Harold interrupted, "and will ensure that the next Harold Wickham doesn't spend 42 years invisible." The FBI agents finished their work as Assembly Line 7 continued its perfect mechanical song. The machine that had defined Harold's life was finally singing, as it was meant to sing, without secrets, without lies, without the weight of stolen recognition. 3 months later, Harold Wickham stood in the Midwest Manufacturing boardroom, his weathered hand steady as he signed the papers that officially recognized him as the designer of Assembly Line 7. The consulting contract was generous, the back pay settlement substantial, but more importantly, his name would finally appear on the patents where it belonged. Danny sat beside him, now his official apprentice in training, learning the principles of mechanical engineering that Harold had developed over decades of quiet observation. "Mr. Harold," the boy asked as they walked through the factory floor afterward, "do you think the singing machine is happy now?" Harold listened to Line 7's perfect rhythm, watched the workers operating it with new respect for its complexity, felt the satisfaction of seeing his life's work finally acknowledged. "I think she's content, Danny boy. Sometimes that's all any of us can ask for." Outside the factory windows, snow began to fall in gentle flakes, covering the industrial landscape in pristine white, a reminder that even the most worn and weathered things could be made beautiful again. The man who'd been invisible for 42 years had finally found his voice, but more importantly, he'd ensured that future generations would never have to remain silent when their contributions were stolen, their innovations claimed by others, their dignity buried beneath corporate convenience. Justice isn't always swift, but it's always worth waiting for. What would you do if you discovered that the quiet person everyone overlooks might be the genius who built the world around you. Because sometimes, the most important people are the ones we never think to see until the day their silence ends and their truth changes everything. They say that on quiet nights in the old Midwest manufacturing plant, you can still hear Harold Wickham's footsteps echoing through the halls, checking on his machines one last time. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to remember that recognition might be delayed, but it's never denied. Truth has its own timeline, and sometimes the most powerful person in any room is the one everyone assumes has nothing to offer. What stories of unsung heroes do you know? Drop them in the comments below, because everyone deserves to have their contributions remembered.